such an esteemed panel that I don't want to run anything short or rushed. This is a session that in a way you could think of as a thread that runs through almost everything else that we are speaking about. We have here in India, in the Hindu tradition, we have something called a mala, which is like a rosary. In the Christian tradition of sacred beads that are held together by a thread. And that thread is called a sutra. And to me, at this point, the climate crisis has become that thread that runs through everything else. Whatever you're working on, women, children, human rights, water, food, security, conflict resolution, governance, finance, refugees, kind of any aspect of the work that we're doing is already and is just going to continue to be incredibly impacted by the climate crisis. In India, the Indian government, which I will mention here as we are A, sitting in India, B, it's the Indian presidency for the G20, has initiated a beautiful program called Mission Life, which is about bringing climate change home to the ordinary people. That yes, we realize there are changes that need to be made by government, by corporations, by industry, by transportation. But to really get everyone involved, the government has brought out this Mission Life program, which is 75 things in honor of the 75 years of India, that every single person can do to help abate climate change. And it's everything ranging from turning off the tap when you brush your teeth, to carrying your own bag when you go grocery shopping, to carrying your own water bottle so that you don't need to use disposable water bottles, to using solar electricity, to bathing from a bucket, the way that traditionally in India people do, rather than a shower that just keeps going. So it's a vast list, but it's one way in which here in India, the government is really trying to take the climate crisis to the people. With that, I would like to begin with our very esteemed panelists who are going to speak to different aspects of the crisis, of their work on it. We will hopefully be able to begin with introductory comments that are not too long, so that we do have time to have questions and interactions from the audience. I am, however, aware of the level of both expertise and experience as well as passion that our panelists have on this, so I don't want to say something like just 2 minutes. But just, I would say between 3 and 5 minutes, 5 at the max, so that we really do have time to get into a discussion on different questions that we will be looking at. First, we have Professor Catherine Marshall, who didn't need an introduction on day 1 and certainly doesn't need one on day 3. But nonetheless, she is the vice president of the G20 Interfaith Forum. She's also a senior fellow for the Berkeley Center on Religion and Peace and World Affairs. And Catherine, it would be wonderful if you could share with us the work that the Interfaith Forum is doing on this intersection between faith and climate.
Thank you. The issues around climate change, environmental protection, biodiversity protection have been very much part of the deliberations of the G20 Interfaith, really, I think, going back to Australia in 2014. Over the past few years, we have been acutely conscious, I think Fletcher was making some allusion to it this morning, of the very complex set of alliances, institutions, networks that are basically working on the climate issues from a religious perspective. So, for example, the meeting in Abu Dhabi that took place in December did not formally have climate on the agenda because it took place almost within hours of the conclusion of the Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 meetings. And we're very conscious that the COP28 in Abu Dhabi is coming, and there is a lot of discussion about how to have a faith pavilion or how to have a faith perspective. So I think that the number one issue is to be an increasingly effective part of this broader mobilization. There are a couple of points of, we could call them points of light, but I would particularly emphasize the role of Patriarch Bartholomew in the Bologna meeting during the Italian presidency. He presented a call to action that was a powerful and durable call to the religious worlds, but above all to the world leaders for action on climate. And that was reiterated during the Abu Dhabi meeting in the same way that we take great inspiration from Laudato Si and from the leadership of Pope Francis, from the extraordinary range of work that is taking place around that. So those have been sort of very dominant pieces that have shaped the overall agenda of the G20 Interfaith Forum. We have focused on one specific set of issues where we've done a lot of analysis, and we're working on one other that, again, I would welcome feedback on. The area where we have consistently developed policy briefings, both as information sources, but also as the grist for practical action, is on the G20, it's not on the G20, is on the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which is a collaborative effort between religious communities and the United Nations Environmental Program that focuses on the three major rainforest basins, in other words, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia. And it does deal with mobilizing the religious communities for action to protect those rainforests, but also to engage particularly with indigenous communities, which is a vital issue in the rainforests, but which is not always a comfortable and an easy fit with the more traditional religious communities. So that has been a major theme and a major focus. And it has been a centerpiece of Religions for Peace, which has highlighted the importance of protection of the rainforest as one of the major areas of action. So that is a continuing initiative where the analysis and the ideas for future further action are sharpened as we go along. The second area where we've been advised that we could and should focus in the G20 context, in other words, looking not at what governments are going to do generally, but what might happen within the G20 process itself and their summit, is the very complex, rather nasty, and disappointing issue of climate finance. In other words, the mobilization of the resources that are needed to carry promises into action. There are so many different funds, so many shortfalls in those funds, that it is possibly a promising area where religious voices, religious analysis, and some formation, some coalition building might lead us forward. So I think those are the 3 points that I would emphasize: the continuing interest in being part of the broader alliances and coalitions, understanding them better, supporting them, being part of them. Secondly, the specific Interfaith Rainforest initiative, which is of great importance. And finally, digging more into the mechanics, but also the deliverables, the moral issues around climate finance.
Thank you so much, Catherine, as always, for very, very, very wise remarks pointing us in that correct direction. I just wanted to mention, when you were speaking about the indigenous leaders, I realize not any of this is easy, and there's always conflict around different aspects. But I do think that the idea of bringing in indigenous leaders, I know Religions for Peace definitely does, but I feel like perhaps one of the calls could be that in all of our interfaith organizations, work, summit, forums, etc., that we ensure that there is at least one indigenous leader there to really bring that indigenous wisdom in and to speak essentially on behalf of the earth and of that wisdom. We now go next to Catherine, to, did you say Maja or Maya? To Maya Goff, the convener of Climate Governance Commission. Welcome, it's wonderful to have you here. And I wonder, given your work and your experience, if you could speak to what you see as some of the major challenges, but also the solutions to those challenges with regard to working in governance, and how we can, in some way, make a real dent in what's happening with our climate, and ideally be able to abate, if not actually reverse it.
Push it. Wonderful. Thank you so much, and really lovely to be here with you. And I love the focus on solutions and what we can do together. First, before I move to the solutions and what the Climate Governance Commission has been working on, I just want to start with a brief, summary about the latest planetary science in very abbreviated form, because I find even policymakers who are involved in developing climate policy don't always know the full ramifications of the latest planetary science, which is quite new. So the planetary boundaries framework, which was adopted or developed by scientists in 2009, shows 9 basic planetary boundaries, one of which is climate. There's also others related to biodiversity and biodiversity loss and novel entities, chemicals, plastics in the environment. And we've now, as a species, overstepped 6 of 9 of these planetary boundaries. So this is our shared reality, and what we have to do together as humanity, as faith groups, is really to think about how we're going to grapple with this reality of overstepping these planetary boundaries, climate being one very important of these boundaries. And it's something we're going to have to deal with one way or another, because these are scientific, biochemical, et cetera, limits to the planetary system in terms of supporting life on Earth in order for it to flourish. And in terms of where we're at with human-caused climate change, I received the unfortunate news recently that we might overstep the 1.5 degree temperature rise, centigrade temperature limitation, which is the more ambitious target in the Paris Agreement, even within the next several years or around 2025 or even before, and there might be another El Nino cycle coming. So this is also very concerning, as the IPCC has said. This is really a limit. It's a red line. It's not just, you know, a more ambitious target. It's something that if we pass beyond, we'll face really catastrophic risks for populations around the world, and of course all life forms. So the UN Secretary General has been trying to raise the alarm. He said, you know, in response to some of the IPCC reports, this is a code red for humanity. He's asked all nations to declare a state of climate emergency. And so this decade now that we're living in really is crucial. And based on our current actions and policies of all governments, we're on a path to 2.6 to 2.7 degree warming, which is catastrophic, according to the scientists. So we're actually in this new era, the Anthropocene. Geologists and other scientists have suggested this new terminology to refer to this era where human activity is the dominant influence on the climate and environment. But what this means is that we've had the power to change the atmosphere, the climate, to actually define a new geological era. But this means we also have the tools to undo this damage, to repair this damage, and to bring our Earth system back into balance. So this is also the very strong message of hope that we've been working also with groups such as the Exponential Roadmap Initiative that has mapped out solutions across various sectors. With even current technology, we have the solutions and the tools to address climate change. But there's an action gap, an education gap, policy gap, and also a main focus of the Climate Governance Commission is the global or the international governance gap that we're really focusing on to try to offer some new solutions, some new thinking to the international community about how we can use our international cooperation as our superpower, as really like a powerful tool where we must really address this challenge and this emergency. So the Climate Governance Commission, we started with a first strategy meeting at Ban Ki-moon's Global Green Growth Institute in Seoul in 2019, and we've been developing, policy thinking and briefs. Since then, we have a very strong Indian partner, the Council on Environment, Energy, and Water here in New Delhi, and they're advising the Indian government, including with respect to G20. We have strong Brazilian partners also, one of the next G20 meetings, who's working now in the president's office there. And we've convened and put together now a set of 18 commissioners who will serve as ambassadors for the Climate Governance Commission's proposals, suggestions, including 3 members of the Elders, an organization founded by Nelson Mandela, to really suggest to the world and to help to support humanity with ethical leadership, impartial leadership, nonpartisan leadership. So we're trying to work up various solutions to fill what many of these commissioners say is a real governance gap currently. So interfaith perspectives, faith and interfaith perspectives are absolutely fundamental, in my view, to really addressing the climate challenge and the whole planetary boundaries challenge, because these are interrelated planetary boundaries. So across a whole range of areas, of course, like our sense of unity as a human family, as this beautiful mantra that we see for the Indian presidency of the G20, to ensure justice, equity, protecting the vulnerable, making sure we reach down to local communities. So the international is not antithetical to the local. All levels of governance should be harmonious and related to each other. Proper use of resources, both our technology, which is an incredible tool to attack the climate and ecological challenges we have, but finance, as we heard, we have a tremendous amount of money and finance in the world, but we're seeing failures of imagination and will in order to mobilize this finance. And one of the papers among various ones we've commissioned is really about, okay, how can we raise vast new amounts of international public finance? And there's many very sound suggestions from different experts. So I'm very much out of time, so I might start there. But we have a whole set of thinking indeed around the solutions and how we can work together better at the international level and amongst various communities.
Thank you so much for that. It's so wonderful to have different speakers from different sectors and different experiences to actually be able to put, shall we say, the beads together on this rosary of what each of us can do in each of our ways, in each of our areas of impact and influence. So thank you so much. And we, moving on, move to Dr. Reverend Samuel Saxena, who is the director for the Center for Advanced Religious Studies, academic consultant at Caleb Institute, and supporting officer, WEA Sustainability Center, Bonn University. And to Dr. Reverend Samuel Saxena, I would ask you to talk about two interrelated questions, one being that intersection between what we call science and spirituality, but more specifically, we'll say science and theology. So where many people think that they are separate, and either you look at the world from a religious theological viewpoint, or you look at it from a scientific viewpoint, looking at the intersection of both of those insofar as ways that religions, religious people, religious leaders, religious organizations can actually address climate change from the scientific perspective.
Thank you, ma'am. Indeed, it's a privilege to be part of this forum. We all know that climate challenge or climate change is a very serious issue. And science is continuously warning all of us. And it takes time for religion or religious leaders to take up this matter, because we think we live in our own world. But thank God for science and technology, which is continuously giving caution to all of us. And in that light, when we talk about the relationship between science and religion, Ian Barber, a very renowned, he's no more, renowned physicist and a theologian, he talked about 4 model. And when I was thinking about these 4 model, it can easily go into the interfaith dialogue also relation. Now, in that Ian Barber talks about 4 different models. First, he talks about conflict model. And this conflict model, he says that science and religion has got nothing to do. They are 2 powerful entities, and they are self-sufficient. They don't need to. I mean, some people think about like that. Some leaders, some scientists. What I need to do with faith. So one model is this. Second, then he shifts with independent model. That means we are powerful, so you be in your own area and let us be in my own area. So there is a watertight compartment between the two. Then he mentions about the dialogue. Okay, there are differences. There are points where we cannot come together, but there are point of contacts also. Let's talk about. And then he comes up with integration. And this integration talks about, when we talk about the dialogue, in dialogue we come up with certain points, contact points, and then we start talking about how science and religion can come together. I give you one example. In 1990, a group of leading scientists and Nobel laureates, headed by Carl Sagan, he planned for a national religious partnership for environment that was held in Moscow. And there was an appeal that was made to all religious leaders and all scientists to come together on the same platform in order to preserve the environment. So that was, I think, maybe the first time, or maybe before some people may have come together, like scientists and religious heads, but this was probably the first time when all of them came together, forgetting all their differences, and they talked about preserving and cherishing the earth and appeal for joint commitment in science and religion. And that is very important. In fact, before that, in 1986, I was going through the history of all this. There was an SSC declaration where Pope Francis and others came together, religious heads, in order to talk about to save the environment. And this needs to continue. While going through certain organizations, I found that most of the organizations which talks about interfaith, the interfaith forum when it comes to climate change and environment, they are in the West. And Asia, I'm working on Asia's environment, and we all know the condition of Asia, how much climate change is affecting our Asian countries. But hardly you will find any interfaith centers which only talks about environment. I think we need to work more on that. They're very limited, but not as much as that the West is doing. So coming back to the relationship between science and religion, we need to come up with unity. In fact, when it comes to the theology, I was reading one book which talks about that there should be a space, space be given to others. There is a word kenosis in Greek, and this word kenosis talks about, having a space for others. So when we read a Bible, it talks about love thy neighbor as thyself. And there we begin, having a dialogue, having a relationship with others. So the challenge is not only between the relationship between science and religion, but also among the religions, because we have so many differences. So we have so many differences, and as you know that somebody was mentioning, there are 16 religions and approximately 4,000 sects which are there. So first we have to come together, and we have to understand, yes, climate change, environmental crisis is really a big issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This intersection between science and religion, I agree, is critical. They're not nearly as separate as a lot of people think they are. We'll leave that for another discussion, but there's so much more overlap than most people realize, and if we actually could work much more closely together rather than assuming that we are enemies or assuming that there is somehow animosity and unbridgeable chasms, I think the work would be a lot more effective and a lot more efficient. Next, we have Gopal Patel, who is the co-founder and director of Bhumi Global, a Hindu faith-based NGO that works to educate and mobilize Hindus for environmental action. He's also co-chair of the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council and serves on the advisory board for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And Gopal, it would be wonderful if you could speak to us about what are the centers of excellence within religious communities for advocacy and action on environmental issues.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sadhvi. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well after the excellent lunch and the post-lunch slump. I'm going to talk about one area of emerging advocacy for faith-based organizations. I wish to speak a word for nature, as Henry David Thoreau said, and talk specifically about NB-SAPs. Anybody here familiar with NB-SAPs? 2 people. Great. All right. So I have hopefully a captive audience. As UNEP framed the environmental crisis, it's a triple planetary crisis of climate, biodiversity, and pollution. And so the NB-SAPs relate to biodiversity. So in Montreal, at the end of last year, the Convention on Biodiversity met for their COP15, where the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. This is a new framework for the next decade to protect biodiversity, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And why is this important on a panel for climate change? Because protecting nature, protecting biodiversity is 30% of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so we have to ensure that nature is protected if we want to meet the goals of Paris. And just some context setting, in the last 50 years, we've lost about 69% of biodiversity globally. In some parts of the world, that's 90% of biodiversity loss. The rate of extinction for species globally is about 10 to 100 times the natural rate of extinction. And so we are in a place in the world right now, not geographically, but in a point in time where the fabric of life, in addition to climate change, is really threatening human well-being and planetary health. And so the Global Biodiversity Framework is a real opportunity to reverse those alarming trends when it comes to biodiversity loss. And the reason I said this is an emerging space for faith groups to be advocating is because these NB-SAPs are national biodiversity strategies and action plans. In Montreal last year, every country that's a signatory to the CBD, that's not every country in the world, but most countries, have agreed to write up NB-SAPs to report back to the CBD at COP15 next year. So there's a real moment right now where we can all be advocating as faith-based organizations to governments, including those part of the G20, to ensure that their biodiversity strategies are as strong as possible to meet the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the framework is exciting and ambitious and quite progressive, I think a lot of people would say. There are 23 targets, 4 goals. Within the 23 targets, there are targets specifically related to gender. There's strong inclusion of indigenous peoples and local communities. There's strong targets there for the business community. So I would encourage all of us, if you're not familiar with the 23 targets and the 4 goals of the GBF, please look at them because they are quite inclusive and, as I said, help us get towards the goals of climate. Now, why is this important to faiths, or what are faiths doing on this? A number of us are coordinating a coalition of faith-based organizations on the GBF. In Canada, we had about 30 religious groups as part of the advocacy efforts there. And there's a growing movement of religious communities across the world now recognizing that just as we have advocacy in the UNFCCC space, that advocacy in the CBD space is equally important and both need to go hand in hand. And one thing we've also found is that some groups really want to do biodiversity work, which maybe struggle entering into the climate space. Those of us who go to the CCC processes and go to the COPs know how difficult and stuck that process is. But the CBD process is very open, very inclusive, and there is significant movement there. And we also find theologically, some religious groups gravitate more to a conversation around biodiversity than they will towards climate change. Just within my own community of Hindu groups, we conducted a survey about 2 years ago of about 500 Hindus across the world, and we asked them, what are your primary environmental concerns? And biodiversity came out higher than climate change. And what we see within the faith groups that we work with on biodiversity is that they get excited, they get animated when they talk about sacred rivers, sacred animals, plants, oceans, language which really kind of fills the human spirit, less so than the technical, complicated conversations in the climate space around financing and just transition and renewable energy and so on like that. So there's a real opportunity here for faith communities to engage in the biodiversity agenda within the context of the CBD and the NB SAPs. And it's not a question of either or. It's not climate or biodiversity. Both need to go hand in hand because, as I mentioned, nature biodiversity is 30% of the climate solution. And so as an emerging center of excellence or advocacy, I really want to encourage all of us to put a bit more focus on biodiversity because that is an area that's emerging and where we can have some success. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gopal. With the rate at which we are losing species every moment, every year, it's certainly a crisis within a crisis. And on a spiritual level, it's a beautiful crisis in a way to look at and deeply realize because it reminds us how interconnected we are. Otherwise, you think, oh, what's a bumblebee? Or, oh, what's that type of worm? Or that type of mosquito? Or that type of butterfly? Like, what kind of impact could that possibly have on us? Okay, it's gone extinct, big deal. And yet, what we realize is the moment you pull one thread, the entire tapestry starts to come apart. And biodiversity is the aspect that highlights that, I think, more powerfully than anything else. So thank you so much for highlighting that for us today. We now have the Reverend Fletcher Harper, who is the Executive Director of Green Faith, an international grassroots multi-faith climate justice organization with members in 40 countries, as well as staff in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Green Faith campaigns in support of universal clean energy access, an end to new fossil fuel projects, and related financing and commitments to loss and damage funds for climate vulnerable nations. And Reverend Fletcher, I'd like to ask you to address what the religious and moral message should be to the G20 as well as to COP28.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, this will be something of a reprise of what I said this morning, but it's stunning that neither the G20 nor the G7 nor the UNFCCC processes have ever dealt seriously with the need for a fossil fuel phase out. Fossil fuels are about 80% responsible for the emissions and cause of the climate crisis, deforestation, which Catherine referred to, is the other 20%. Those are approximate figures, and of course the issues are interrelated, but you've got 80% of the problem and no language. I believe it was this past COP or 2 COPs ago in Glasgow was the first time in close to 30 COPs that there had been the beginnings of discussions about language with this. So we've got the mechanism that's supposed to be sort of facilitating the solution that is unable to talk about the problem. And when we ask ourselves, why is that? It's because there's a combination of factors. It's an enormously wealthy and powerful industry. And there are also real political factors at play. We know that it is politically challenging for candidates from any party to use that kind of language. When President Biden was campaigning against former President Trump, he let slip late at night at the middle of a debate that we were talking about the end of the fossil fuel industry, and his aides quickly walked back that comment, noting something about age or the time of the night or something like that. But that's what we're dealing with, is the need for the end of an industry, and we have no intergovernmental processes to date that have been capable of addressing that head on. So a big part of what the faith communities need to do is to start to socialize that language and the recognition of the importance of that. We're part of an initiative that we think is a meaningful one called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is something that's gained the support of over 100 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama. The Vatican has come out in support of it, as has Islamic Relief worldwide, the Islamic Society of North America, several branches of the Anglican Communion, and a number of other religious organizations, the World Council of Churches. And what that framework says is that what is needed is a new binding international framework that says we have to have an immediate end to new fossil fuel projects, an equitable phase out of existing production, and international financial commitments to a just transition for impacted communities. This is eminently sort of sensible and self-evident in terms of what needs to happen. It's at the stage now where it is the highly idealistic vision of what is needed, but we're starting to see the beginning of momentum. Tuvalu and Vanuatu have become the first nation states that have openly called for such an agreement. Denmark and Costa Rica have started something called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is a conversation among nation states about committing to no new fossil fuel development. These conversations will not happen overnight, but it's really essential that religious communities start to say the honest truth, which is that we have to have a phase out of fossil fuels. We cannot solve the climate crisis without it. The idea that there will be technologies that can remove carbon from the atmosphere may well be true at some point in the future, but they are not true now, and there is no prospect for them being true at scale within the next decade. So we have to move now on this, and there is no answer except to dramatically phase down and phase out fossil fuels. So I think that's the most important message for religious communities towards the G7 and G20 and towards governments at the sort of domestic level as well. We've talked about the fact that technologies are there to facilitate a rapid clean energy transition, and we need to double down and triple down on that because that's the right thing to do, and that is doable at this stage with greater concerted effort. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's such a clear and powerful message, and I was wondering as you were speaking whether as leaders, if we came together with this one very clear message across religions, across races, across regions, and if we took a collective, unanimous position on this, and then encouraged, exhorted our massive communities around the world to use their votes, their money, their influence that they have in whatever way they have those, in favor of ensuring that our governments do that. It feels like that could be a huge movement across the world, that if instead of having separate messages or diluted messages, we came together, even just with that one very specific agenda, that perhaps I have faith, I'm an optimist, that, you know, they say faith can move mountains. We don't need to move the mountains. We just need to stop fossil fuel emissions. And we need so much more than that, but at the bare minimum, we need that. And can we collectively come together in a way that is so strong, so undeniable, and that is not just us sitting on a stage speaking to a tiny handful of people, but that is actually to all of our massive international followers to take steps. You know, we were speaking earlier today about new definitions of sin and merit, of pop and punya, to really start to give a religious angle to fossil fuel emissions, that this is sin, this is wrong, and the impact that that could have on all of our populations. I think that would be a really strong and hopefully very successful initiative that together we could do. Our last speaker, and then we'll circle back with more questions and conversation, is Pinaki Das Gupta, a member of the Working Group on Pollution, Faith for Earth Initiative, and a senior consultant for the Associated Chambers of Commerce and Industry of India. So I'm wondering if you could speak to us about the work that Faith for Earth is doing, the lessons that have been learned, and any of the tools, techniques, best practices that can be implemented by faiths working for the earth, together with Faith for the Earth, but also in individual capacities as faiths working for the earth. What have you learned that can be shared with everyone?
Pranam and good afternoon. Thank you, Puja Sadhvi ji, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists. I'm honored to be here, and this question is so huge and complex that I think it will take me long to elaborate. But in terms of religion and science, I think religion came much before science existed. This I'm saying even if I am a person of science. And religious in scriptures and religious kind of motivation and lessons, they were always pro-environment. If we talk about movements like Vishnouis, we talk about other people, pastoral community, traditionally, they were all eco-friendly. So, and science was established much later. I remember 350.org, it was one of the earliest science-based movements globally, which talk about the safe limit of carbon dioxide as 350 ppm. Now then I thought, and then has been like a lot of changes in the science-based approach. So Faith for Earth in the UNEP, right now it's focused on plastic pollution, to say that. But then it kind of weaves back to the question of climate change and what it is for the community, the faith-based communities, their followers, their believers. And I pulled up, when we are talking about science, I pulled up a kind of some stats and to give you kind of an kind of overview of what actually 1.5 degrees centigrade would mean. And it is for South Asia. It means that there would be 1.6 times the flood, which will increase, 10 times increase in heat waves, and 3 times the increase in crop failures. Now this is kind of very concerning, alarming. I think the faith-based organizations, they are already doing much. It's only maybe because we are on ground and we do a lot more work than talking. That's why we feel that our works aren't being kind of amplified or presented well. And I think if we talk about lot of ground level initiatives, network of networks like the URI. And Sadhvi, you have been part of the WASH Alliance. So there have been so many good works on water and hygiene. I think there has to be a direct and indirect, tangible and intangible kind of output and outcomes which have to be brought out in terms of the international forums like COPs. And Gopal mentioned about biodiversity CBD. But I think we are also equally concerned about desertification. I think going forward is at an FBO level, at a religious level, we ought to understand that when we talk about climate change, it is not for the science, but it is for the people. And science is just a tool which kind of amplifies the good of religion. I personally don't see any difference between science and religion, because science is, of course, a kind of indicator, but science cannot explain a lot of things, which probably our faith can at some level. And so I think I will conclude by saying that and in India and everywhere else, like the Rainforest alliances, I don't know, I don't have the figures that if the Rainforest alliances have taken a carbon audit or not, but it would be interesting to take the success of Rainforest alliances and such initiatives through a science-based target indicators. For example, if you say that, okay, this initiatives has led to such and such reduction of carbon. Now that is simply the science. If we say that, okay, through these water conservation measures, we have got around maybe millions of people out of water scarcity and having an equitable and kind of access to like safe drinking water. It is SDG 6 we are covering. So I think we just need to kind of, as Fletcher said, I love that we need to have a common narrative. And of course, I think in terms of the energy perspective, there's a lot of things which have been done in India and also elsewhere, like the Brahma Kumaris have done a lot of good work on solar. And I think for that, I remember Green Faith did a report on the coverage of renewable energy by faith-based organizations in India. And we could find that there are kind of maybe in the scale of gigawatt, which have solar installation, which the FBOs have done. So that is incredible, I think. So going forward, I think what we need to do is kind of think in a way which is, for the lack of word, more holistic and more kind of interconnected in terms of science and religion, not seeing them at a separate entity, but as two sides of the same coin. And number two, as faith-based organization, we need to also be inside the room. I think in the last panel someone said we have to be inside the room and to kind of clarify that we need to be in and within the kind of decision-making bodies on climate change. So international policy, maybe decarbonization, low carbon pathways, all these things. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For the next 30 minutes, which is what we have left of the panel, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Catherine Marshall to moderate, because I very unfortunately have to leave to catch a flight to Gujarat. But it has been an incredible honor to moderate the first part of this panel, to learn so much, to be so deeply inspired by the work of all of the people on the panel. And I leave you in Catherine Marshall's incredible hands for the discussion session of this. And thank you all so much for not just your thoughts today, but for the really great work that you are doing all over the world.
Thank you, Sadhvi. Have a good trip. Thanks. She left a little sooner than I thought she was going to. I think what we'll do is we'll have a quick sort of follow-up within the panel, and I will set a bit of the challenge and then open it up to comments and questions, challenges coming from our audience. I think several people have basically put the challenge of the G20 Interfaith Forum as finding ourselves somewhere between aspiring to be at the table, and as you know, if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. That the basic idea is that we are aspiring actually to have a specific voice, not on a single issue, but on a pretty wide range of issues, but also to be part of the very complex efforts to mobilize, and perhaps even a third challenge, which is in a skeptical world, to be convincing that the voice of these religious communities, diverse, fractious, complex as they are ones that the policymakers like the G20 need to listen to and will benefit from listening to, because there is wisdom, there is genuine, authentic wisdom, there is the voice, as we like to think, the voice from the end of the road, the people whose voices are not normally heard in the settings. That is what we aspire to convince that we represent. So being the insider, outsider, the question I think we all need to think about is, where is the G20 interfaith voice most effective? Is it in trying to identify some of the major issues around climate finance, which deal with adaptation, which deal with mitigation, which deal with loss and damage, which deal with all of the other aspects of the climate challenge? Is it instead to be part of an angry mobilization, saying governments have failed, it's time now, right away, to act in ways that will save our children's planet? Is it part of our challenge to scare the wits out of people? There's some very scary numbers, by the way. A very large part of India in not a very far distant future is unlikely to be inhabitable, according to some of the latest figures, not to speak of the disappearance of large areas of coastline. So those, let me go right down the group with, if you can be fairly brief, because time goes very quickly when you're enjoying your speaking. I have to put myself in that category a bit, but so that if we can at least get some sense really focused on the G20 interfaith. This is one of many platforms, a network that aspires to bring together different networks, that has to recognize that there are huge disagreements within the communities as well as among them. So what do you see as the place where we should be putting our energies? So I'll turn to you, Maya.
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of potential. The G20, also as we heard at the opening, it really sort of represents a cross-section of nations in the world and the fractures that are in the whole of the international community. So also, if you can address some of those at the G20, it bodes well for the whole international community. And I think, what I'm seeing is that nation states, believe it or not, and governments are really in need of support. They're in need of a lot of helpful ideas, imagination that just doesn't come with sometimes, kind of more insular policy circles. So I think, diverse faith communities in that respect have a lot to offer, and also to have, a more hopeful vision, to have, yes, it is a crisis, there's no doubt about that, we have to be realistic, but I think the potential, if we make this transition in a just way and all of the unbelievable well-being, social, economic, et cetera, well-being that we can achieve through, digitization techniques, clean energy, distributed renewable energy, for electrification, addressing energy poverty. Like, there's an unbelievably positive vision, also economically. Oxford research, for example, has seen, like, or has revealed, trillions invested now will save tens of trillions in the future. So there's also really hard economic data about why we need to act fast and do this energy transition. But just back to just a little bit about, nations needing support, because there is, there's this anger and of course understandable, grief about the lack of action and that we've left things very late. But again, there needs to be this active, cooperative sort of working together in terms of, for example, sharing vital policies across nations. How do you phase out fossil fuel subsidies and transition them so, to protect the middle class or the most vulnerable, and to catalyze this green energy? It should be like an innovation explosion, really, and in circular economy. And so, for example, one proposal we have is for an international policy hub where countries can actively innovate with each other. So, like, some of these very positive solutions can be also brought to the table at the same time as reminding states of their clear ethical duties and the urgency of the situation. Also, there's a new business culture that should also be, an economically sort of oriented organization like the G20. There are extraordinary business leaders that are thinking holistically, that are also quite rooted in faith traditions. So in terms of the new normal of businesses around the world, it's not just in Europe, it's not just in North America, businesses being protagonists of actually solving ecological and social problems. I think that's also something that could be highlighted at the G20. And then just lastly, in terms of the use of international power and our shared culture of what we expect in the international community, it's very mainstream to be, zero sum, and every country is sort of jockeying to be the regional power or economically the strongest, and there's very unhealthy competitions. To shift that to a more mature, wise kind of approach for international relations, which we need for the climate and all the intersecting challenges. We need a new ethos for governmental leadership and for our international relations paradigms. And I think the faith community can bring that very powerfully to the G20, like the normative, as someone mentioned earlier, the soft power, I think is very strong. And I find leaders across various sectors, they're very much looking for wisdom. They're looking for values and ethics-based frameworks to support them and help them in navigating what's in front of them now.
Great. I think this careful balance between fear and despair and hope and vision is one to navigate. Reverend Samuel.
I always feel that G20 is a bigger platform, and it's a very excellent platform where people from different faith can come together. And when we talk about the climate challenge, I think in order to talk about, we need to more look into the unity part. Unity is very, very important because we cannot live in separate compartments. So if G20 continues to work, and I think this time the theme, One Earth, One Family, One Future, it talks about unity. So that we all may understand that we belong to one family. And when we talk about this, there are 3-4 things that I want to just quickly share. When we are on this earth, we are called to live as a living companions with nature. So we have mountains, rivers, plants, and birds. So we are companions to each other. And then comes the people, our relationship with others. We participate in others' joy and others' suffering. And religion, as we have been talking about, religion plays a vital role in that. Then connecting with social organization, where Interfaith Forum becomes very important, where we become the voice of the voiceless, where we talk about these issues and able to convey, to the government, whether it's government of India or any other governments. And I think when the leaders, they go with that vision, with that plea, governments take things very seriously. And there comes the justice. There is no peace, there can be no peace without social justice. So social justice can only come when we involve ourselves with social organization. And the last is the dimension of time, metanoia, where we are all renewed, that space needs to be given, where the whole earth, needs to be refreshed. So there are themes within religions, like Christianity emphasizes on forgiveness, loving thy neighbor as thyself, and earth's redemption. Hinduism and Buddhism talks about tolerance and non-violence. Judaism on shalom and sabbath. Sikhism talks about giving respect to nature elements. Baha'i religion talks about principle of unity, and that can help human to flourish. And then Islam talks about purity and charity. All these things, when come together, I think when we unite these things together at this platform, it will definitely help, and it will help us to understand our priority. It will help us to bring us to together, the consensus, and then it will give us strength. So that's my...
Great. Unity.
Unity.
Gopal.
Thank you. It's not an easy task these days to try and be a religious voice heard in the world and to be relevant. It's something I think about often. I think it would be interesting. This is my first time engaging with the forum, and thank you for the invitation and learning more about it. I think it would be really interesting to explore, and it may already be happening, to do in-country events in each of the country members of the G20 in the year leading up to the main meeting. I think some local level advocacy would be important, and engagement. I also am thinking of what Fletcher was saying with the fossil fuel industry, that it has to come down at some point, and it will. And here we are in India, where my uncle walked in the Salt March against the British, and Gandhi, brought down the British Empire, and something that people thought would never ever happen. And one of his tactics was just to shame the British, until morally they just couldn't do it anymore. And so I think we have to find a way to speak into these spaces, whether it's the G20 or UN spaces or something like that. And it can't be from one individual NGO's perspective. We do have to find a collective strategy, and it is about being outside and being inside. But the task is not easy. But I think Gandhi's model of moral outrage and shaming those in power, I think, is a good model that we could probably take inspiration from while we're here in India.
Fletcher.
Yeah, echo Gopal's thanks for the invitation to be here. And I'm not certain about the nature of the relationship between the Interfaith Forum and the G20 itself, and what sort of channels of communication do or don't exist, and what's possible. I think that what's most important for any religious sort of formation around this issue is to know what the priority issues are and to be relentlessly firm. We're facing a crisis, and we see too much work from religious communities that is not clear enough about the factual urgency of the issue, and then an unwillingness really to hold strong in disagreement with government or multi-governmental forums, and sort of almost a sort of reticence or a lack of conviction. I think that I think governments rely on various forms of civil society, including the religious sector, to put the questions to government very forcefully, because governments know that they can't move until there's critical mass at some level within society itself. So whatever the forum would choose to do, I would say do it with all your might and don't be shy.
Do it with all your might and don't be shy. So, Pinaki?
Yeah, I was thinking, what should I say? Because this is, again, a very challenging question. It's not easy to suggest that what I could say to G20, and because it has been 10 years now, G20 forum is there. But I was just writing notes, and I thought of writing 5 A's, the A's as in Ace. And probably G20 could look into that, and we as team, as kind of happy speakers could also dwell. First is the alignment. I think we have to align ourselves with the global goals, with the challenges of today, with a sense of urgency. We have to show that leads to more kind of awareness, that because G20 also has a focus on education. I'm so happy to listen to the panelists on education. I think we need to step up in terms of having bold education, not just education which inspires us and the future generation. Of course, they are inspired already, and they are in a soup because of us. But I think we need awareness, nevertheless, for the FBOs, for the leaders. Then we need action. I think that is one component I would personally love to see from G20 members in supporting community-based action, projects, engagements, finance, because I think that is very important. The fourth is advocacy. I think because that is where the strength lies of all our members' expertise. And the fifth is actually activism, which Fletcher also kind of moots, because without activism at a certain level, all the 4 A's would not be able to stand. So, yeah, I think that's for me. I think 5 A's, 5 A's for G20. Thank you, Kathy.
Very good. I don't know if we have some mics or if we have any questions, but as people are reflecting, I know a few years ago at one of the meetings of the Parliament of the World's Religions, there was one track that was dealing with poverty and one track dealing with climate change. And they didn't meet. They were on parallel tracks. In other words, the sort of emphasis on dealing with the promise of ending poverty and dealing with the most vulnerable, et cetera, and then the climate change. And at the very end, there was a meeting of the 2 groups, which found each other really in a fundamental clash, where of course, one of the basic principles behind the development world is that you need to have growth, that growth creates jobs, that creates the resources so that you can finance education, so that you can finance healthcare. But the angry reaction from the climate team was that you have to stop growth, degrowth. You have to move in a different direction. I hope this is some years ago that we've come some way since, that we have at least tried to bring together some of these different aspects. But what we're hearing here is the pressing urgency of more action on the climate side. I think we're hearing more hope that the technical solutions have moved much further and much faster than we had imagined. But that still the finance that's needed is woefully short. There are ideas on the table, including for the G20 with the reform of the multilateral banks, which is a very central, critical issue right now. These are the hot issues for September that are on the G20 agenda. So I think we have a long way to go between the fear versus hope, between trying to balance our concern for social justice, because there will be no peace without justice, with this urgent need for abrupt changes that will be painful. If you've ever been in a country where fuel subsidies have been cut, you can have no doubt that about the degree of energy that that kind of situation can mobilize. So, are there any comments or questions? Or okay, Maria Lucia.
Thank you. No, I just have a comment which was in relation to the question asked to Reverend Samuel in terms of the relation between science and religion or theology, as Sadhvi said. I do think that the key to advance the work of religious communities in advocating for solutions to the issues of climate change lie on that dialogue between science and religion. I think if we have more religious leaders speaking from the science perspective and then mobilizing the hearts of people and policymakers, we can have a better chance of change. I think these are two powerful sides that need to come together. And from my point of view, if we, for example, I understand from Dana Humay that she wants to organize a series of meetings during this year in Germany and the Philippines and Kenya and so on. I do think in those spaces, rather than having, again, us talking, it's, what are the algid points? And for me, the issue of climate change is bringing the scientists to the table with the religious leaders and coming up with some concrete actions. And then we go out of here, what can we do together, as Gopal was saying, at the national level. This is something that we can do very concretely. And maybe it's not going through all the topics, but maybe selecting one very specific that can make a difference and where religious leaders can have a prophetic voice. So that's just a reflection.
Yeah, can I say something?
I think that the point of the need to have a much broader-based discussion, particularly focused at the country level, which gets us into the dilemma of the G20, which is not the most inclusive body by definition. So you want to make a quick comment?
Yes, and thank you so much for elaborating that, because, somebody has said, science does not need religion, neither religion needs science, but human needs both. So there are contact points where science and religion, scientists and religious leaders can come together. And this momentum is now, growing, especially in India also, among Catholics, and there is also a group, Bhakti Vedanta group in India, and that's science and spirituality to talk about. So I think that is making a lot of difference among younger generation. And to reach younger generation, these two areas, bringing them together, will really help our country or whichever country we talk about. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'll just add on to you, if I may. I think we always talk about that faith leaders need to be sensitized about science, and but I think it has to be the other way also around. Bring faith to science, because that has a lot to do, a lot to offer. Because faith is a very powerful tool, and I think scientists need also a sensitization on interfaith communication. So what would be my take on that. So there has to be two-way thing. Thank you.
Are there any other burning comments? If not, I'll make one comment and then see if we want to try to end up close on time so that we have coffee and we're moving to the conclusion of long days in these conference rooms. But my one concern is that we not become too focused on unity. I mean, we clearly need to have coalitions which are moving in the right direction. One of my colleagues who's a specialist in strategy describes strategy in an American Western term, which is you keep the herd moving generally westward. In other words, you have many different parts that will be going in different speeds, sometimes different directions, but that you're trying to keep the direction. So I think that the ideal of having a full religious unity behind a specific action plan is improbable, and also I think speaks against the challenges of being the insider-outsider. In other words, being in a position to appreciate the vision and the understandings and even the pressures on the policymakers at the same time that you have this, what Fletcher says is you have to have your eye constantly on the issue. And I also think that it means that people will be taking different parts of the challenge in different ways and at different times. The biodiversity challenge, the rainforest challenge, the fossil fuel challenge, the plastics issue, the oceans, each of them has great importance, and you shouldn't forget which ones actually make the most difference, but somehow the ideal of a full unity, I think, is a bit treacherous as a path. But that doesn't mean that we don't keep the herd moving generally westward, and that we try to keep to the different elements of it. So with that, we've all had several rounds, but is there any last burning comment that anyone would like to make? Yes, Maya.
Just in terms of, the issue of discontinuing fossil fuel subsidies or other changes, which, they're pretty fundamental in some respects, or many respects, structural energy system changes. They don't necessarily have to be painful, and this is, again, this notion of policy design and policy sharing. That's been also an area that has really evolved in terms of mitigating the transition in various respects for consumers, for others, for example, just transition, fossil fuel workers in various regions. And there's economists that have modeled a very painless just transition, which isn't actually very expensive, for example, to provide for early retirement, and pensions for coal workers in the coal sector, et cetera. So these are actually policy options they're still, sadly, they're not mainstream, but they're there. Scandinavian policies can be very sophisticated in terms of the energy transition, and so I think there are more and more options there, and the EU, for example, with the energy shock because of the Ukraine invasion is an example of you know, a large economic unit where, despite the energy shocks to the Union, had an incredible response in terms of mitigating, in large part, the effects on consumers and heating their homes, but also then accelerating their climate goals. They're going to be ahead of their targets. And that was sort of against all odds. That wasn't expected. It was like way more successful than anybody had imagined. So I think there are real pathways for this transition in an extremely positive way that really increases social well-being. And on the GDP issue and in growth, or you know, there's some evidence now that GDP growth can itself be decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions growth, right? But it also depends your metrics. GDP, you know, is now considered, you know, quite old-fashioned. We need beyond GDP metrics. We need to measure ecosystem services, you know, circularity, resource use in an economy, et cetera, et cetera. So if you have growth with the right metrics and also well-being based on human well-being, so there's so many different options and new thinking that really do merge the social, economic, human well-being with addressing climate and planetary crisis, triple planetary crisis. So on that front, there's also a lot of hope.
I subscribe to one of Madeleine Albright's phrases, which was that she says, "I'm an optimist who worries a lot." And I think I fit into that category, that I welcome your spirit of optimism about the compatibility and about the possibility of sensible, well-designed, socially just policy. But we've seen too many examples of the failure to do that, to be entirely optimistic, shall we say.
There's a lot of work to do.
I will end with one last comment, which I think is an important one, that we are focusing here largely on the faith advocacy and on the faith activism as part of the broader community that is seeking genuine, sustainable solutions that allow us to deal with the vulnerable and the suffering in the world at the same time that we deal with the suffering of the planet and recognize that they go together. But I think that there is one other area that is worth mentioning, and that is the example. There is quite a lot of work being done on science-based targets for religious communities that will set the example of what can and should be done. And there are a number of cases in different parts of the world. So I think that this idea, yes, Greta Thunberg crossing the Atlantic in a sailboat is one. I'm not sure how many of us came to India that way. But I think that the idea of living the advocacy is an important part of the authenticity and the possibility of the message being conveyed. So with that, I would like to thank all of these wise people, wise and committed activists, and thank all of you, the bold audience who have stayed throughout. And we will move on to the next stages.
Thank you.